This is a common rule that will really help you with your writing if you follow along. The rule's titles seem daunting, right? When to use a comma, and the question is when to use a comma with dependent clauses. So a dependent clause is a clause that can't stand on its own. It can't be its own sentence, right? A dependent clause is going to have a subject and a verb, but it won't have a complete thought. And an independent clause, what we call a sentence, is going to have a subject plus a verb plus a complete thought. So the comma rule is about using dependent clauses and how to use commas with them. And it says if you have an introductory dependent clause, then you have to follow that dependent clause with a comma. So what makes a dependent clause dependent? Why can't it stand on its own? It's a word, or sometimes a cluster of words, but there are approximately 13 to 14, depending on how you count in the English language, of these words that create dependent clauses. We can call them dependent words, but they have a real grammatical name, and they're called subordinating conjunctions. I can explain the name to you, but I won't, right? Dependent word, subordinating conjunction is the same thing. They create dependent clauses, and here they are, most of them. If is the most big one. You know that if you begin a sentence with if, you're going to have to put a comma before then, so it's sort of the rule personified. Since. If you begin a sentence with since, you're going to have to put a comma before the independent clause, right? So if you begin a sentence with any of these words or word clusters, you will follow the dependent clause. I'm going to go back up here with a comma, and then you give the independent clause. But if the role is reversed, if the independent clause comes first, you don't add a comma. You just write it out. Okay? So again, the rule says use a comma after an introductory dependent clause. If a dependent clause comes at the beginning of a sentence, you follow it with a comma and you separate it from the independent clause here. But if they're reversed, no comma is necessary. And this is really important. The reason is because, if you use fewer commas, your message is better. You don't want to just keep interrupting yourself and messing up the flow of your own verbiage, especially in argument, because the reader is distracted from the argument itself by all the interruptions. So let's move down to the examples. Here's an example. I have an introductory dependent clause, right? My dependent word, or my subordinating conjunction, is the word although. Now, the rule says if I begin a sentence with a dependent clause, I must separate it from the independent clause with a comma. So this is properly done. Although he is tall, comma, he can't play basketball, right? Now over here, I flip it so that the independent clause comes first. He can't play basketball, although he is tall. If the independent clause comes at the end, do not put a comma before although. Do not put a comma before because. Do not put a comma before since or any of these other words either. What I see a lot in student writing is that you just freak out. I mean, not you personally, but students in general. And anytime you see the word although, you just like, oh, I need a comma. You throw it like right after the word or something like that. It just looks ugly. So we want to avoid that. We want to understand the grammar. You have to have the entire clause, right? And then separate it from the independent clause. And if you want to understand this a little bit more, a clause, when we talk about parts of speech and separate parts of sentences, right? There are two basic kinds that we talk about. A clause is just a group of words containing a subject and verb. That's it. That's all it is. It's that simple. If it has a subject and verb in it, it's going to be a clause. A phrase is just a group of words. In other words, it won't have a subject and verb combination. So when you look at rules and they distinguish between clauses and phrases, that's all you need to know. So we have introductory prepositional phrase that we covered. Well, there's no subject and verb in those, so it's just called a phrase. A clause will have a subject and verb, and there are two types. And now you know that if you begin a sentence with a dependent one that can't stand on its own, you can't just say, although he is tall. That's not a sentence. Yeah, we have to put a comma after it at the beginning of a sentence. But if it comes at the end, we don't. Whatever you do, don't just drop commas in without knowing why.